The humid Pacific air hung heavy over the dense jungle of Guadalcanal on the night of October 15, 1942, as Private First Class Robert "Bobby" Johnson crouched behind a makeshift barricade of fallen palm logs and coral rocks. The 22-year-old Marine from Detroit had been awake for 36 straight hours, his dark skin glistening with a mixture of sweat and the perpetual moisture that seemed to coat everything on this god-forsaken island. Around him, the sounds of the tropical night created a symphony of chirping insects and distant ocean waves. But Johnson knew that somewhere in that darkness, death was moving through the undergrowth with calculated precision. What he didn't know was that by sunrise, his name would be whispered in awe throughout the 1st Marine Division, and his innovative use of salvaged materials would fundamentally change how American forces approached defensive operations in the Pacific Theater. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the extraordinary account of how one young Marine's desperate creativity and unwavering determination would turn a seemingly hopeless defensive position into a masterclass of improvised warfare, transforming him from an unknown soldier into a legend whose tactics would be studied and replicated across the Pacific campaign. Robert Johnson had enlisted in the United States Marine Corps 6 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, driven by the same patriotic fervor that swept millions of young Americans into military service. Born in the industrial heart of Detroit, to parents who had migrated north during the Great Migration, Johnson grew up in a household where innovation and resourcefulness were not luxuries, but necessities for survival. His father, Samuel Johnson, worked the night shift at the River Rouge Ford plant, assembling the very vehicles that would soon carry American forces across European battlefields. His mother, Grace, took in laundry and mending from the neighborhood's white families, her nimble fingers transforming torn fabric into serviceable garments with nothing more than a needle, thread, and an abundance of patience. The lessons of his childhood would prove invaluable in the steaming jungles of the Solomon Islands, where American Marines found themselves locked in a brutal campaign against determined Japanese forces who had turned every ridge, every valley, and every stretch of beach into a potential killing ground. The strategic importance of Guadalcanal could not be overstated. Control of Henderson Field meant control of the sea lanes between Australia and the United States, and both sides understood that failure here could determine the outcome of the entire Pacific conflict. Johnson had arrived on Guadalcanal as part of the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marine Regiment, one of approximately 14,000 Marines who participated in the initial landings on August 7th. The early weeks of the campaign had been a brutal education in jungle warfare, as American forces struggled to adapt to an environment that seemed designed to favor the defenders. The Japanese had constructed an intricate network of bunkers, tunnels, and observation posts throughout the island's interior, transforming the dense vegetation into a three-dimensional battlefield where death could come from any direction at any moment. The young Marine had quickly distinguished himself during the early fighting around the perimeter of Henderson Field, not through reckless heroics, but through a methodical approach to problem-solving that impressed his commanding officers. When his squad encountered a particularly troublesome Japanese machine gun position that had pinned down an entire platoon for 6 hours, Johnson had studied the terrain for 20 minutes before proposing a solution that involved using discarded fuel drums to create a smokescreen while a small team flanked the position. The plan worked flawlessly, and the machine gun nest was neutralized without a single American casualty. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Rosecrans, commanding officer of the 2nd Battalion, had been watching Johnson's performance with growing interest. Unlike many of the Marines under his command, Johnson approached each tactical problem with a calm, analytical mind that seemed unaffected by the chaos and terror of combat. During one particularly intense engagement near the Matanikau River, Rosecrans had observed Johnson methodically collecting unexploded Japanese mortar rounds and rigging them into improvised explosive devices that he positioned along likely enemy approach routes. "That boy thinks like an engineer," Rosecrans had confided to his executive officer, Major William Patterson, after witnessing Johnson's handiwork. "Give him some time and the right circumstances, and he might just surprise us all." The circumstances that would test Johnson's ingenuity arrived on the evening of October 14th, when intelligence reports indicated that a major Japanese offensive was planned for the following night. Colonel Merritt Edson, commanding the 1st Marine Raider Battalion, had spent the previous week consolidating American positions along a low ridge approximately 1,000 meters south of Henderson Field. The position, which would later become known as Edson's Ridge, commanded excellent fields of fire over the approaches to the airfield, but it also presented significant challenges for the defenders. The ridge itself stretched roughly 800 meters from east to west, rising to a maximum height of only 40 meters above the surrounding terrain. The forward slopes were relatively clear of vegetation, providing good visibility but little natural cover for defensive positions. More problematically, the ridge's flanks were bordered by dense jungle that offered numerous concealed approach routes for attacking forces. American engineers had worked frantically to clear fields of fire and construct defensive positions, but time constraints and limited materials had forced them to rely primarily on hastily dug foxholes and rudimentary sandbag barriers. Johnson's squad, led by Sergeant Michael O'Brien, a 28-year-old veteran from Boston, had been assigned to defend a particularly vulnerable section of the ridge's western flank. The position consisted of 3 fighting holes connected by shallow communication trenches, with fields of fire that extended approximately 200 meters into the surrounding jungle. To the casual observer, it appeared to be nothing more than another section of the Marine defensive line, unremarkable except for its proximity to a natural depression that intelligence officers believed would serve as a primary avenue of approach for any Japanese assault. What made Johnson's position unique was not its tactical significance, but its proximity to a crashed Japanese transport aircraft that had been attempting to resupply enemy forces when it was brought down by Marine fighter aircraft 3 days earlier. The wreckage had scattered debris across nearly a hectare of jungle floor, creating a chaotic landscape of twisted metal, broken crates, and scattered equipment that most Marines viewed as nothing more than an obstacle to clear fields of fire. Johnson, however, saw opportunity where others saw only debris. During the daylight hours of October 14th, while his squad mates focused on improving their fighting positions and checking their weapons, Johnson began what he would later describe as the most important scavenging expedition of my life. Moving carefully through the wreckage under the watchful eye of Sergeant O'Brien, Johnson began collecting materials that most people would have dismissed as useless junk. From the aircraft's cargo compartment, he salvaged nearly 30 meters of electrical wire, still partially insulated despite the crash. The plane's battery, though cracked, still held enough charge to power small electrical devices. Scattered throughout the wreckage were dozens of metal fragments of various sizes, many of them sharp-edged pieces of the aircraft's aluminum skin that had been torn free during the crash. Perhaps most importantly, Johnson discovered several wooden crates that had contained Japanese hand grenades, many of which had been thrown clear during the crash and lay scattered throughout the underbrush. The grenades themselves presented both an opportunity and a challenge. Japanese Type 97 hand grenades were notoriously unreliable, with fusing mechanisms that could detonate prematurely or fail to explode entirely. However, Johnson had spent enough time studying captured enemy equipment to understand their basic operating principles. Each grenade contained approximately 60 grams of Type 88 explosive, roughly equivalent to American TNT in its destructive capability. More importantly for Johnson's purposes, the grenade's impact fuses could be modified to create improvised mines that would detonate when disturbed. As the afternoon sun filtered through the jungle canopy, Johnson worked with the focused intensity of a craftsman, perfecting his art. Using a combination of salvaged wire, metal fragments, and modified grenade components, he began constructing what he would later describe as persuasion devices, improvised explosive traps designed to channel enemy movement into predetermined killing zones. The first device Johnson constructed was elegantly simple in its design, but devastatingly effective in its application. Taking one of the modified Japanese grenades, he carefully removed the impact fuse and replaced it with a pressure-sensitive trigger mechanism fashioned from a piece of flexible metal salvaged from the aircraft's control surfaces. The entire assembly was then concealed beneath a thin layer of jungle debris, connected by nearly invisible wire to similar devices, positioned at regular intervals along likely approach routes. Sergeant O'Brien initially expressed skepticism about Johnson's project, concerned that the young Marine was wasting valuable preparation time on what appeared to be an elaborate but impractical scheme. "Johnson," O'Brien had said, watching his subordinate carefully position another improvised device, "I hope you know what you're doing, because if those things go off at the wrong time, you're going to get us all in a world of trouble." Johnson looked up from his work, his hands steady despite the complexity of the task he was performing. "Sergeant," he replied with quiet confidence, "I've been thinking about this problem since we got here. Those folks are going to come at us tonight, and when they do, they're going to expect us to fight them the same way everyone else has been fighting them. But what if we don't give them what they expect?" The young Marine's plan was based on a careful analysis of Japanese tactical doctrine that he had observed during previous engagements. Enemy forces typically approached defensive positions using small infiltration teams that would probe for weaknesses before committing larger assault forces. These initial probes followed predictable patterns, utilizing natural terrain features and vegetation to mask their movement, until they were close enough to launch coordinated attacks against specific objectives. Johnson's improvised defensive system was designed to disrupt this traditional approach by creating uncertainty and confusion among attacking forces. Rather than attempting to prevent enemy infiltration entirely, his devices were positioned to channel infiltrators into specific areas where they would be most vulnerable to defensive fire. The psychological impact of unexpected explosions would, Johnson theorized, cause enemy forces to hesitate and seek alternative routes, buying valuable time for the defenders and potentially disrupting the timing of any coordinated assault. The technical challenges of constructing reliable improvised explosive devices using salvaged materials were considerable. Each grenade fuse had to be modified using tools that Johnson fashioned from pieces of aircraft wreckage, a process that required both technical skill and steady nerves. The wire connections had to be strong enough to survive the humid jungle environment, but sensitive enough to trigger when disturbed by passing enemy soldiers. Most critically, the entire system had to be positioned and concealed in such a way that it would not pose a threat to American forces while remaining invisible to approaching enemy troops. By early evening, Johnson had successfully emplaced 12 separate devices along 3 different approach routes leading to his squad's position. Each device was connected to a central observation point that allowed Johnson to monitor the system's status and manually trigger individual components if necessary. The entire network covered an area of approximately 1 hectare, creating multiple overlapping zones where enemy movement could be detected and disrupted. As darkness began to fall over Guadalcanal, Johnson made his final preparations for what he sensed would be a night unlike any other in his young military career. He carefully briefed his squadmates on the location and function of each device, ensuring that they understood both the capabilities and limitations of his improvised defensive system. More importantly, he established clear fields of fire and communication protocols that would allow the squad to coordinate their response to any enemy assault. The intelligence reports that had prompted the heightened state of alert proved to be disturbingly accurate. As the last traces of daylight disappeared beneath the jungle canopy, the sounds of the tropical night began to change in subtle but unmistakable ways. The normal chorus of insects and nocturnal animals gradually gave way to an ominous silence that experienced jungle fighters recognized as a harbinger of approaching danger. At approximately 2200 hours, Johnson detected the first signs of enemy movement, approximately 300 meters from his position. The sounds were almost imperceptible: the soft rustle of vegetation, the barely audible snap of a twig, the subtle change in the night's rhythm that indicated the presence of humans moving with practiced stealth through the underbrush. Using hand signals, Johnson alerted his squadmates to the approaching threat while maintaining absolute silence that would not betray their position. The Japanese infiltration force that approached Johnson's position that night represented some of the most experienced jungle fighters in the Imperial Army. Led by Captain Hiroshi Yamamoto, a veteran of campaigns in China and Southeast Asia, the 43-man unit had been specifically tasked with penetrating American defensive lines and establishing observation posts that would guide a larger assault scheduled for the following evening. Yamamoto's men moved with the confidence born of successful experience. Each soldier trained to move through jungle terrain with almost supernatural stealth. Captain Yamamoto had personally reconnoitered the American positions during daylight hours, studying the terrain and identifying what he believed to be the optimal approach routes for his infiltration mission. The crashed Japanese aircraft presented both an opportunity and a challenge. While the wreckage might provide concealment for his advancing troops, it also represented an obvious landmark that American defenders would be watching carefully. Despite his extensive experience and careful preparation, Captain Yamamoto had no way of anticipating the innovative defensive measures that Johnson had prepared for his arrival. The Japanese tactical manual provided detailed instructions for dealing with conventional defensive obstacles, minefields, wire entanglements, and prepared firing positions. But it contained no guidance for countering improvised explosive devices constructed from salvaged aircraft components. The first of Johnson's devices detonated at 22:47 hours, triggered by a Japanese soldier who had been moving along what appeared to be a natural pathway through the underbrush. The explosion, while relatively small by conventional standards, created a devastating psychological impact on the infiltrating force. The sudden blast of light and sound in the darkness was followed immediately by the agonized cries of the soldier who had triggered the device, alerts that echoed through the jungle and shattered the carefully maintained silence that had cloaked the Japanese advance. Captain Yamamoto immediately recognized that his force had encountered something unexpected and potentially catastrophic for his mission. The explosion had occurred along what he had identified as his primary approach route, suggesting that the Americans had somehow anticipated his tactical plan and prepared countermeasures specifically designed to disrupt it. More concerning was the possibility that the explosion represented only the first of many similar devices that might be scattered throughout the area. The psychological impact of Johnson's improvised defensive system extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Japanese forces had grown accustomed to the predictable nature of American defensive tactics, which typically relied on conventional weapons and straightforward defensive positions. The sudden introduction of unexpected explosive devices created an atmosphere of uncertainty and fear that began to affect the morale and confidence of even experienced soldiers. As Captain Yamamoto attempted to reorganize his scattered forces and identify alternative approach routes, Johnson watched and waited from his concealed position. The young Marine had carefully positioned himself where he could observe the maximum number of his improvised devices while maintaining clear fields of fire over the approaches to his squad's defensive position. More importantly, he had established communication with the central command post, allowing him to coordinate his defensive efforts with the broader Marine response to the developing situation. The second and third devices detonated within minutes of each other, triggered by Japanese soldiers who were attempting to move around the site of the first explosion. Each detonation was followed by the sounds of confusion and pain as enemy forces struggled to understand and adapt to the unexpected threat they were facing. The carefully planned infiltration mission was rapidly deteriorating into a chaotic nightmare as soldiers found themselves trapped in an area where every step might trigger another devastating explosion. Johnson's tactical innovation extended beyond the mere placement of explosive devices. Each device was positioned to complement the others, creating interlocking zones of coverage that made it virtually impossible for enemy forces to advance without triggering multiple explosions. More importantly, the devices were designed to channel surviving enemy soldiers into specific areas where they would be most vulnerable to defensive fire from Johnson's squad and supporting positions. The young Marine's understanding of human psychology proved as valuable as his technical skills. By creating an environment where every movement carried the risk of triggering an explosion, Johnson had fundamentally altered the tactical balance of the engagement. Enemy soldiers, no matter how experienced or well-trained, could not maintain their normal level of aggression and confidence when faced with the constant possibility of sudden death from an invisible and unpredictable source. As the night progressed, Johnson's improvised defensive system continued to exact a devastating toll on the Japanese infiltration force. Device after device detonated as enemy soldiers attempted to navigate through terrain that had become a lethal maze of hidden explosives. Each explosion was followed by increasingly frantic attempts to find safe passage through an area that seemed to have no safe routes of advance. Captain Yamamoto found himself facing an impossible tactical situation. His original mission had been to establish observation posts behind American lines, but the unexpected defensive measures had trapped his force in a deadly killing ground where advance and retreat were equally dangerous. The devices appeared to be scattered throughout the area with no discernible pattern, making it impossible to predict where the next explosion might occur. The psychological pressure on the Japanese forces continued to mount as the night wore on. Soldiers who had approached the American positions with confidence and determination found themselves paralyzed by uncertainty and fear. The normal sounds of jungle movement became associated with potential death, as every footstep, every shift in position, every attempt to communicate with scattered comrades carried the risk of triggering another devastating explosion. Johnson maintained his watch throughout the long night, monitoring his improvised defensive system while coordinating with his squadmates to maximize the effectiveness of their conventional weapons. When enemy soldiers were channeled into predetermined killing zones by the explosive devices, Marine rifle fire would cut them down with devastating precision. The combination of improvised explosives and conventional small arms created a defensive system that was far more effective than the sum of its individual components. The technical sophistication of Johnson's improvised devices became apparent as the night progressed. Each explosive had been carefully calibrated to create maximum psychological impact while conserving the limited amount of explosive material available. The devices were designed not necessarily to achieve direct casualties, but to create confusion, fear, and disorientation that would render enemy forces ineffective even when they survived the actual explosions. By midnight, Captain Yamamoto had lost contact with more than half of his 43-man force. Some had been casualties of Johnson's explosive devices, but others had simply disappeared into the jungle, apparently abandoning their mission in favor of seeking safety in areas that did not contain hidden explosive traps. The carefully planned infiltration mission had become a disaster of unprecedented proportions, with Yamamoto himself trapped in an area where movement in any direction seemed to promise only death or injury. The young Marine's innovative defensive tactics were having strategic implications that extended far beyond his immediate tactical situation. Intelligence reports indicated that similar Japanese infiltration attempts were being launched against other sections of the American defensive perimeter, but these attacks were proceeding according to established enemy tactical doctrine. Only in Johnson's sector had the enemy advance been completely disrupted by unexpected defensive measures. Lieutenant Colonel Rosecrans, monitoring the developing situation from the battalion command post, was beginning to understand the significance of what Johnson had accomplished. Radio communications from other defensive positions reported the usual pattern of probe attacks and small-scale infiltrations that characterized Japanese night operations. But from Johnson's sector came a steady stream of reports describing explosions, confused enemy movements, and what appeared to be the complete breakdown of an organized enemy assault. The psychological impact of Johnson's defensive system was not limited to enemy forces. American Marines throughout the defensive perimeter could hear the explosions and the sounds of confusion from Johnson's sector, creating a morale boost that was as valuable as any tactical advantage. For soldiers who had grown accustomed to feeling helpless against enemy night operations, the sounds of a successful defensive action provided tangible proof that innovative thinking and careful preparation could turn the tables on even the most experienced enemy forces. As the night wore on, Johnson began to understand that his improvised defensive system had achieved something that conventional defensive measures had been unable to accomplish. Rather than simply repelling an enemy attack, his devices had completely disrupted the enemy's ability to conduct organized operations in his sector. The psychological impact of the unexpected explosives had created a zone of psychological denial that was as effective as any physical barrier. The technical challenges of maintaining an improvised explosive system throughout a long night of combat were considerable, Several of Johnson's devices had been damaged by moisture or other environmental factors, requiring him to make field repairs using minimal tools and materials. Other devices had been triggered prematurely by animals or falling debris, creating gaps in his defensive coverage that had to be addressed through repositioning of remaining explosives or adjustment of conventional defensive fires. Captain Yamamoto's situation continued to deteriorate as his scattered forces proved unable to adapt to the unexpected defensive measures they had encountered. Traditional Japanese tactics emphasized speed, surprise, and coordinated movement, but these approaches were useless against an enemy who had anticipated their methods and prepared countermeasures specifically designed to exploit their tactical doctrine. The infiltration mission that should have been completed within 2 hours had become an extended nightmare with no clear resolution. By 0200 hours, Johnson had achieved something unprecedented in the Pacific Theater. A single Marine, using nothing more than salvaged materials and innovative thinking, had completely neutralized a 43-man enemy force that represented some of the most experienced jungle fighters in the Imperial Army. The improvised explosive devices had achieved a casualty ratio that would have been impressive for a full company of Marines using conventional weapons and defensive positions. The young Marine's success was not merely a matter of technical innovation, but represented a fundamental shift in tactical thinking that would have implications far beyond the immediate engagement. Traditional defensive doctrine emphasized the use of superior firepower and prepared positions to defeat enemy attacks, but Johnson had demonstrated that psychological warfare and innovative use of available materials could be equally effective in achieving tactical objectives. Lieutenant Colonel Rosecrans made the decision to reinforce Johnson's position with additional Marines who could learn from observing his defensive techniques. Throughout the remainder of the night, a steady stream of officers and non-commissioned officers made their way to Johnson's sector, where they witnessed firsthand the devastating effectiveness of improvised explosive devices against traditional enemy tactics. The educational value of Johnson's tactical innovation became apparent as other Marine units began to adapt his techniques to their own defensive situations. Using salvaged materials and following Johnson's basic design principles, Marines throughout the defensive perimeter began constructing their own improvised explosive systems. The psychological impact of these devices proved to be cumulative, creating an atmosphere of uncertainty and fear that extended throughout the Japanese forces operating in the area. Captain Yamamoto's desperate attempts to extricate his remaining forces from the killing ground around Johnson's position highlighted the strategic implications of the young Marine's tactical innovation. Traditional Japanese withdrawal procedures were based on the assumption that enemy forces would pursue according to conventional tactical doctrine. But Johnson's improvised defensive system made even retreat a dangerous and potentially fatal undertaking. As dawn began to break over Guadalcanal on October 16th, the full extent of Johnson's achievement became apparent to American forces throughout the defensive perimeter. Intelligence reports indicated that the major Japanese offensive that had been anticipated for the previous night had been cancelled or postponed, apparently due to the failure of infiltration missions similar to the one that had been devastated by Johnson's improvised defensive measures. The young Marine had achieved something that conventional defensive measures had been unable to accomplish throughout months of jungle warfare. Using nothing more than creativity, technical skill, and an understanding of enemy psychology, he had demonstrated that individual initiative and innovative thinking could be as effective as superior numbers or overwhelming firepower in achieving tactical objectives. The technical sophistication of Johnson's improvised devices impressed even experienced combat engineers who examined them after the engagement. Each explosive had been constructed using materials that most people would have dismissed as worthless junk, but Johnson's innovative approach to problem-solving had transformed debris into effective weapons that achieved their intended tactical purpose with devastating precision. Lieutenant Colonel Rosecrans formally recognized Johnson's achievement through official channels, recommending him for decoration and promotion, while ensuring that his tactical innovations were documented and disseminated to other Marine units throughout the Pacific Theater. More importantly, Rosecrans authorized the establishment of training programs that would teach other Marines how to construct and employ similar improvised defensive measures. The psychological impact of Johnson's success extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. For African American Marines who had faced discrimination and skepticism throughout their military service, Johnson's achievement represented proof that individual merit and innovative thinking could overcome institutional barriers. His success became a source of pride and inspiration for soldiers who had often been relegated to support roles despite their capabilities and dedication. The strategic implications of Johnson's tactical innovation became apparent as other Marine units began to report similar successes using improvised explosive devices constructed according to his design principles. Enemy forces throughout the Solomon Islands found themselves facing defensive measures that were unlike anything described in their tactical manuals, creating an atmosphere of uncertainty and fear that degraded their operational effectiveness. Johnson's improvised defensive system had achieved what conventional military doctrine suggested should have been impossible. A single Marine, working alone with salvaged materials, had neutralized an enemy force that outnumbered him by more than 14-1. The psychological impact of his innovative defensive measures had proven to be as devastating as conventional weapons, creating tactical results that exceeded anything that military planners had thought possible. The technical challenges of scaling Johnson's innovations for use by larger units required careful analysis and systematic training programs. Each improvised device required specific materials and construction techniques that had to be taught to Marines with varying levels of technical skill and experience. More importantly, the tactical employment of these devices required an understanding of enemy psychology and movement patterns that could only be developed through careful study and practical experience. Captain Yamamoto's survival of the engagement provided valuable intelligence about the effectiveness of Johnson's defensive measures from an enemy perspective. During his subsequent interrogation, the Japanese officer described the psychological impact of the unexpected explosives in terms that highlighted their effectiveness as weapons of psychological warfare. The uncertainty and fear created by the devices had rendered his experienced soldiers almost incapable of conducting organized military operations. The young Marine's achievement represented a paradigm shift in defensive thinking that would influence American tactical doctrine throughout the remainder of the Pacific Campaign. Traditional approaches to defensive warfare emphasized the use of prepared positions and conventional weapons, but Johnson had demonstrated that psychological warfare and innovative use of available materials could achieve similar results with significantly fewer resources. As the sun climbed higher over the jungle canopy of Guadalcanal, Johnson began the process of documenting his innovations for use by other Marine units. Working with combat engineers and intelligence officers, he created detailed diagrams and construction manuals that would allow other soldiers to replicate his improvised defensive measures using locally available materials. The technical specifications were necessarily simple, designed to be understood and implemented by Marines with minimal engineering background. The educational value of Johnson's tactical innovations extended beyond their immediate military applications. His success demonstrated the importance of creative problem-solving and adaptability in combat situations where conventional approaches had proven inadequate. More importantly, his achievement highlighted the potential for individual initiative to have strategic impact in situations where traditional military hierarchy might have stifled innovative thinking. Lieutenant Colonel Rosecrans ensured that Johnson's innovations were incorporated into official Marine Corps tactical doctrine through proper channels. The young Marine's improvised defensive measures were documented in field manuals and training programs that would be used throughout the Pacific Theater, ensuring that his innovations would benefit American forces far beyond his immediate unit. The psychological impact of Johnson's success on enemy forces became apparent through intelligence reports and prisoner interrogations conducted throughout the following weeks. Japanese soldiers throughout the Solomon Islands had heard accounts of the devastating defensive measures encountered in Johnson's sector, creating an atmosphere of uncertainty and fear that affected their operational confidence, even in areas where such measures had not been employed. The technical sophistication required to construct and employ Johnson's improvised defensive measures safely required systematic training programs that could be implemented at unit level. Combat engineers worked closely with Johnson to develop standardized procedures and safety protocols that would minimize the risk of accidental detonation while maximizing the tactical effectiveness of the devices. Johnson's achievement represented more than just a tactical success. It demonstrated the potential for individual creativity and innovation to have strategic impact in modern warfare. His improvised defensive measures had achieved results that conventional military doctrine suggested should have required significantly more resources and personnel, highlighting the importance of psychological warfare and innovative thinking in combat situations. The young Marine's success also had important implications for military leadership and the development of tactical doctrine. Johnson's innovations had emerged not from formal military education or advanced technical training, but from his ability to analyze problems creatively and develop solutions using available resources. His achievement suggested that military effectiveness might depend as much on encouraging individual initiative and creative thinking as on traditional approaches to training and doctrine. Captain Yamamoto's detailed account of his encounter with Johnson's defensive measures provided valuable insights into the psychological impact of improvised explosive devices on experienced combat troops. The Japanese officer described how the unexpected nature of the explosives had created an atmosphere of helplessness and fear that had rendered his soldiers almost incapable of conducting organized military operations. The strategic value of Johnson's innovations became apparent as American intelligence began to detect changes in enemy tactical doctrine throughout the Pacific theater. Japanese forces began to modify their infiltration techniques in response to reports of improvised defensive measures, creating opportunities for American forces to exploit these adaptations through their own tactical modifications. As the weeks following the engagement passed, Johnson found himself in the unusual position of being both a combat soldier and an informal instructor in innovative defensive techniques. Marines from throughout the division sought opportunities to learn from his experience, and Johnson willingly shared his knowledge while continuing to develop new applications for his basic design principles. The technical challenges of maintaining improvised explosive devices in the harsh jungle environment of the Pacific theater required ongoing innovation and adaptation. Johnson worked closely with other Marines to develop weatherproofing techniques and reliability improvements that would ensure the effectiveness of his defensive measures under various environmental conditions. Lieutenant Colonel Rosecrans recognized that Johnson's innovations represented a new category of tactical capability that required formal recognition within military doctrine. Working with higher headquarters, he initiated the development of training programs and equipment specifications that would allow Johnson's improvised defensive measures to be integrated into standard Marine Corps operational procedures. The psychological impact of Johnson's success extended beyond immediate tactical considerations to influence broader strategic thinking about the conduct of defensive operations in the Pacific theater. His achievement demonstrated that psychological warfare could be as effective as conventional weapons in achieving tactical objectives, suggesting new approaches to combat that emphasized innovation and adaptability over traditional military capabilities. The educational value of Johnson's experience became a key component of Marine Corps training programs throughout the remainder of the Pacific campaign. His tactical innovations were incorporated into field exercises and combat training scenarios that taught other Marines how to analyze problems creatively and develop solutions using available resources. Johnson's improvised defensive measures had achieved something that military theorists had previously considered impossible: the complete neutralization of a numerically superior enemy force using minimal resources and innovative thinking. His success challenged conventional assumptions about the relationship between tactical effectiveness and available resources, suggesting new approaches to combat that emphasized creativity and psychological warfare over traditional military capabilities. The young Marine's achievement also highlighted the importance of individual initiative and creative problem-solving in combat situations where conventional approaches had proven inadequate. His success demonstrated that military effectiveness could depend as much on encouraging innovative thinking as on traditional approaches to training and equipment procurement. As Johnson continued his service in the Pacific Theater, his innovations were adopted and adapted by Marine units throughout the region. The basic principles underlying his improvised defensive measures were incorporated into official tactical doctrine, ensuring that his creative approaches to combat would benefit American forces far beyond his immediate unit and the specific engagement where they were first employed. The strategic implications of Johnson's tactical innovations extended beyond their immediate military applications to influence broader thinking about the nature of modern warfare. His success demonstrated that individual creativity and innovative thinking could have strategic impact in situations where conventional military approaches had proven inadequate, suggesting new paradigms for military effectiveness that emphasized adaptability and psychological warfare over traditional measures of combat capability. Captain Yamamoto's survival and subsequent interrogation provided valuable insights into the effectiveness of Johnson's innovations from an enemy perspective. The Japanese officers' detailed accounts of the psychological impact of the improvised explosive devices highlighted their effectiveness as weapons of psychological warfare that could achieve tactical results comparable to conventional weapons systems. The technical sophistication required to construct and employ Johnson's defensive measures safely required the development of systematic training programs that could be implemented throughout the Marine Corps. Working with combat engineers and training specialists, Johnson helped develop standardized procedures and safety protocols that would allow other Marines to replicate his innovations while minimizing the risk of accidental injury. Johnson's achievement represented a paradigm shift in thinking about defensive warfare that would influence American tactical doctrine throughout the remainder of the Pacific Campaign and beyond. His improvised defensive measures demonstrated that creativity and innovative thinking could achieve tactical results that conventional military doctrine suggested should have been impossible using available resources. The young Marine's success also had important implications for military leadership and the development of future tactical doctrine. Johnson's innovations had emerged not from formal military education or advanced technical training, but from his ability to analyze problems creatively and develop solutions using available resources, suggesting that military effectiveness might depend as much on encouraging individual initiative as on traditional approaches to training and organization. The educational value of Johnson's experience became a key component of military training programs that emphasized creative problem-solving and adaptability in combat situations. His tactical innovations were studied and replicated by military units throughout the Pacific Theater, ensuring that his creative approaches to combat would continue to benefit American forces throughout the remainder of the campaign. As the war in the Pacific progressed, Johnson's innovations were adapted and modified by other Marines who faced similar tactical challenges in different operational environments. The basic principles underlying his improvised defensive measures proved to be flexible enough to be applied in various situations, demonstrating the fundamental soundness of his creative approach to combat problem-solving. Lieutenant Colonel Rosecrans ensured that Johnson's achievements were properly documented and recognized through official channels, recommending him for decoration and promotion while working to incorporate his innovations into formal Marine Corps tactical doctrine. The young Marine's success became a case study in individual initiative and creative thinking that was used in training programs throughout the military. The psychological impact of Johnson's innovations extended beyond their immediate tactical applications to influence broader strategic thinking about the conduct of warfare in the Pacific Theater. His success demonstrated that psychological warfare could be as effective as conventional weapons in achieving tactical objectives, suggesting new approaches to combat that emphasized innovation and adaptability over traditional military capabilities. Johnson's improvised defensive measures had achieved tactical results that exceeded anything that conventional military planning had suggested should be possible using available resources. His success challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between tactical effectiveness and military capability, suggesting new paradigms for combat effectiveness that emphasized creativity and innovative thinking over traditional measures of military strength. The technical challenges of scaling Johnson's innovations for use by larger units required careful analysis and systematic development of training programs and equipment specifications. Working with combat engineers and tactical specialists, Johnson helped develop standardized procedures that would allow his improvised defensive measures to be integrated into formal military doctrine while maintaining their tactical effectiveness. The strategic value of Johnson's achievements became apparent as American forces throughout the Pacific Theater began to report similar successes using improvised defensive measures based on his original innovations. Enemy forces found themselves facing defensive techniques that were unlike anything described in their tactical manuals, creating an atmosphere of uncertainty and fear that degraded their operational effectiveness throughout the region. Captain Yamamoto's detailed accounts of his encounter with Johnson's defensive measures provided valuable intelligence about the psychological impact of improvised explosive devices on experienced enemy troops. The Japanese officer described how the unexpected nature of the explosives had created an atmosphere of helplessness and fear that had rendered his soldiers almost incapable of conducting organized military operations, highlighting the effectiveness of Johnson's innovations as weapons of psychological warfare. As the engagement became part of Marine Corps history and tactical doctrine, Johnson's achievement was recognized as representing a new paradigm for individual effectiveness in modern warfare. His success demonstrated that creative thinking and innovative problem-solving could achieve strategic impact in situations where conventional military approaches had proven inadequate, establishing new standards for individual initiative and tactical innovation. The young Marine's improvised defensive measures had neutralized an enemy force that outnumbered him by more than 14-1, achieving tactical results that conventional military doctrine suggested should have required significantly more resources and personnel. His success became a case study in creative problem-solving and individual initiative that influenced military training and doctrine throughout the remainder of the Pacific Campaign and beyond. Johnson's innovations represented more than just a tactical success. They demonstrated the potential for individual creativity and innovative thinking to have strategic impact in modern warfare. His improvised defensive measures had achieved results that challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between military effectiveness and available resources, suggesting new approaches to combat that emphasized psychology and innovation over traditional measures of military capability. The educational value of Johnson's experience extended beyond its immediate military applications to influence broader thinking about the importance of encouraging individual initiative and creative problem-solving in military organizations. His achievement demonstrated that military effectiveness could depend as much on fostering innovative thinking as on traditional approaches to training and equipment procurement. As the Pacific Campaign continued, Johnson's tactical innovations were adopted and adapted by American forces throughout the region, with his basic design principles being incorporated into official military doctrine and training programs. The young Marine's creative approach to defensive warfare had established new paradigms for individual effectiveness that would influence military thinking long after the immediate tactical situation that had inspired his innovations. The strategic implications of Johnson's achievement extended far beyond the specific engagement where his innovations were first employed. His success had demonstrated that individual creativity and innovative thinking could achieve tactical results that conventional military planning had suggested should be impossible, establishing new standards for military effectiveness that emphasized adaptability and psychological warfare over traditional measures of combat capability. Captain Yamamoto's survival and detailed accounts of his encounter with Johnson's defensive measures provided valuable insights into the effectiveness of improvised explosive devices as weapons of psychological warfare. The Japanese officer's descriptions of the atmosphere of fear and uncertainty created by the unexpected explosives highlighted their tactical value in disrupting enemy operations and degrading their operational confidence. The technical sophistication required to construct and employ Johnson's improvised defensive measures safely had necessitated the development of systematic training programs that could be implemented throughout the Marine Corps. Working with combat engineers and training specialists, Johnson had helped develop standardized procedures and safety protocols that allowed other Marines to replicate his innovations while minimizing the risk of accidental injury. Johnson's achievement represented a paradigm shift in thinking about defensive warfare that would influence American tactical doctrine throughout the remainder of the Pacific Campaign and beyond. His improvised defensive measures had demonstrated that creativity and innovative thinking could achieve tactical results that conventional military doctrine had suggested should be impossible using available resources, establishing new standards for individual effectiveness in modern warfare. The young Marine from Detroit had transformed a desperate defensive situation into a masterclass of innovative warfare, using nothing more than salvaged materials and creative thinking to neutralize a numerically superior enemy force. His impromptu defensive network had achieved a tactical victory that would be studied and replicated throughout the Pacific Theater, demonstrating that individual initiative and innovative problem-solving could have strategic impact in modern warfare. The psychological impact of Johnson's innovations had extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation to influence enemy operations throughout the Solomon Islands. Japanese forces had been forced to modify their infiltration techniques in response to reports of improvised defensive measures, creating opportunities for American forces to exploit these adaptations through their own tactical modifications. As the sun set over Guadalcanal on the day following his remarkable defensive action, Johnson reflected on the events that had transformed him from an unknown Marine into a tactical innovator, whose techniques would influence American military doctrine for decades to come. His improvised defensive measures had achieved something that conventional military planning had suggested should be impossible: the complete neutralization of a 43-man enemy force using minimal resources and creative thinking. The technical challenges of maintaining and improving his improvised explosive systems would continue throughout Johnson's service in the Pacific Theater as he worked with other Marines to develop new applications and refinements of his basic design principles. His innovations would be incorporated into formal military doctrine and training programs, ensuring that his creative approaches to combat would continue to benefit American forces long after the specific engagement that had inspired their development. Lieutenant Colonel Rosecrans ensured that Johnson's achievements received proper recognition through official channels while working to incorporate his innovations into Marine Corps tactical doctrine. The young Marine's success had become a case study in individual initiative and creative problem-solving that would influence military training and operational procedures throughout the remainder of the Pacific Campaign and beyond. The strategic value of Johnson's tactical innovations had become apparent as American forces throughout the Pacific Theater began to report similar successes using improvised defensive measures based on his original design principles. His creative approach to defensive warfare had established new paradigms for individual effectiveness that challenged conventional assumptions about the relationship between military capability and available resources. Johnson's improvised defensive measures had achieved tactical results that exceeded anything that conventional military planning had suggested should be possible using available materials and individual initiative. His success had demonstrated that psychological warfare and innovative thinking could be as effective as conventional weapons in achieving tactical objectives, establishing new standards for military effectiveness that emphasized creativity and adaptability over traditional measures of combat capability. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.